Theodore Roosevelt entered the vice presidency in 1901 under William McKinley, already a national celebrity thanks to his exploits in the Spanish-American War. Known for his booming voice, relentless energy, and reformist spirit, Roosevelt was an unusual pick, chosen mainly to remove him from the more powerful governorship of New York. Party bosses, uneasy with his independence, assumed the vice presidency would sideline him. But Roosevelt treated the role not as ceremonial, but as a platform. He toured the country, gave speeches, and stayed in the public eye. His charisma made him immensely popular. Just 6 months into McKinley's second term, everything changed. After McKinley was attacked at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, Roosevelt rushed to be by his side. Following McKinley's passing, Roosevelt became the youngest president in U.S. history at age 42. His sudden rise transformed the vice presidency from a political dead end into a potential stepping stone to real power. Once in the White House, Roosevelt ushered in the progressive era, taking on corporate monopolies, expanding national parks, and redefining the presidency as an active force in American life. Though his time as VP was brief, it became one of the most consequential in history. Roosevelt's energetic approach, reform-minded agenda, and instant public appeal permanently elevated the expectations for anyone holding the office after him. His vice presidency, though short, was the launchpad for a legacy that reshaped both the role of the executive branch and the American political landscape.
Charles W. Fairbanks served as vice president under Theodore Roosevelt from 1905 to 1909, but unlike his energetic and reform-minded president, Fairbanks was a conservative Republican with a more traditional, reserved approach to politics. Coming from Indiana, he had built a career in law and the Senate before joining Roosevelt on the ticket. Fairbanks was chosen largely to balance the ticket ideologically and geographically, appealing to the more cautious wing of the party. While Roosevelt stormed ahead with his progressive agenda, Fairbanks often found himself on the sidelines, quietly opposing many of the president's reforms, including efforts to regulate big business and labor protections. As vice president, his influence was limited, and he mostly fulfilled ceremonial duties and presided over the Senate with formality but little flair. The lack of collaboration between the two men was no secret. Roosevelt referred to him privately as the iceberg, a nod to his cold demeanor and political distance. After Roosevelt announced he would not seek another term in 1908, Fairbanks hoped to be the Republican nominee but was passed over in favor of William Howard Taft. He later attempted a political comeback as the running mate of Charles Evans Hughes in the 1916 election, but the ticket lost to Woodrow Wilson. Though Fairbanks served during a time of immense presidential activism, his legacy is often overshadowed by Roosevelt's towering presence. His vice presidency is remembered as a study in contrast between bold executive ambition and cautious legislative conservatism, between the momentum of change and the weight of tradition.
James S. Sherman, the vice president under William Howard Taft from 1909 until 1912, was known for his affable personality and the rare distinction of being the first sitting vice president since the 1820s to be renominated for a second term. Coming from Newark and known as Sunny Jim, Sherman was a well-liked congressman before his vice presidency, respected for his calm demeanor and long-standing service in the House of Representatives. Taft chose Sherman to balance the ticket ideologically and help maintain ties with the conservative wing of the Republican Party, which was increasingly uneasy with the rising progressive movement. As vice president, Sherman was largely a figure of party unity, presiding over the Senate with fairness and patience, but he avoided involvement in policy disputes or major legislative battles. His term coincided with the growing split in the Republican Party between Taft's cautious conservatism and Theodore Roosevelt's more aggressive reformism. Sherman firmly aligned with Taft, which put him at odds with the insurgent progressive Republicans gaining momentum by 1912. Despite the mounting tension, Taft still selected Sherman as his running mate for the re-election campaign, hoping to project party stability. However, Sherman's health was in decline, and just days before the election, he passed away, making him the last vice president to leave office while still serving.
Although overshadowed by the internal rifts of the era and the dramatic return of Roosevelt in 1912, Sherman's steady hand and loyal service earned him quiet respect during a deeply fractured time in Republican politics.
Thomas R. Marshall served 2 terms as vice president under Woodrow Wilson from 1913 to 1921, making him one of the few to hold the office through 2 full presidential terms. A former governor of Indiana, Marshall was known for his dry wit, approachable personality, and loyalty to Wilson, though he played only a minor role in shaping policy. He famously quipped, "What this country needs is a good 5-cent cigar," a line that became his most remembered remark. While his humor made him popular with the press and in the Senate chamber, Marshall often found himself excluded from the inner workings of the Wilson administration. Wilson did not view him as a key advisor and rarely included him in cabinet discussions or strategic planning. This distance became especially critical during the final months of Wilson's presidency. In 1919, Wilson suffered a debilitating stroke that left him unable to carry out many presidential duties. For months, the country operated without a clear transfer of power, as neither Wilson nor his advisors informed Marshall of the president's condition. Marshall hesitated to assert authority without a formal declaration of incapacity, fearing a constitutional crisis or accusations of overreach. As a result, the executive branch drifted in uncertainty during a critical post-war period. His handling of the situation sparked debate about presidential succession and eventually contributed to the passage of the 25th Amendment decades later. Though Marshall's contributions were limited by the president's tight grip on power, his presence during one of the most unusual executive impasses in American history left a quiet but lasting impact on how the role of vice president would be seen in moments of crisis.
Calvin Coolidge became vice president under Warren G. Harding in 1921 after gaining national attention for his firm response to the Boston police strike while serving as governor of Massachusetts. A man of few words, Coolidge carried a stoic New England demeanor into office, earning the nickname Silent Cal. His vice presidency began quietly, with Coolidge taking on the standard ceremonial duties and presiding over the Senate without fanfare. However, everything changed abruptly in August 1923 when Harding passed away during a cross-country tour. Coolidge, vacationing at his family's Vermont home without electricity or phone lines, was sworn in by his father, who was a notary public, by lamplight in the middle of the night. Thrust into the presidency with little warning, Coolidge's quiet competence and refusal to court drama appealed to a public weary of Harding-era scandals. He inherited an administration plagued by corruption, including the infamous Teapot Dome affair, and his calm leadership helped stabilize public confidence. His vice presidency, though brief, became a vital transition between 2 very different political figures, Harding's bluster and Coolidge's restraint. While Coolidge is more remembered for his time as president, his ascension stands as one of the most seamless and uneventful transfers of power in U.S. history, ironically achieved by one of the most reserved men ever to hold the office. His quiet strength would soon become his brand, defining the tone of the 1920s as a decade of economic growth, limited government, and subdued executive leadership. Charles G. Dawes, vice president under Calvin Coolidge from 1925 to 1929, was a Nobel Peace Prize laureate, banker, and World War I veteran, hardly the usual resume for a vice president. Known for his sharp intellect and fiery temper, Dawes had gained global recognition for the Dawes Plan, an economic proposal to stabilize post-war Germany and manage reparations after World War I. His entry into the vice presidency was therefore accompanied by high expectations, but his tenure was anything but smooth. His relationship with the Senate was strained from the start. On his very first day presiding over the chamber, he delivered a confrontational speech criticizing Senate rules and the seniority system, instantly offending many senators and setting a tone of mutual resentment. Dawes also had a distant relationship with President Coolidge, who preferred a minimalist and tightly controlled executive branch. Coolidge reportedly disliked Dawes' brashness and shut him out of key discussions, reducing his influence within the administration.
Despite these tensions, Dawes remained a public figure with strong opinions on domestic and international policy, often clashing with more traditional voices in government. After leaving office, he returned to public service as ambassador to the United Kingdom, where he found greater success than in the political constraints of the vice presidency. Charles Dawes is remembered as a man whose talents were often mismatched with the office he held. His energetic, reform-minded spirit found little room to breathe under the shadow of Coolidge's silence. Nevertheless, his global contributions and blunt approach to power left a mark far beyond the quiet halls of the Senate chamber.
Charles Curtis, who served as vice president under Herbert Hoover from 1929 to 1933, holds a unique place in American history as the first person of significant Native American heritage to occupy the vice presidency. Born in Kansas and raised partly on a Kaw reservation, Curtis rose from modest beginnings to become a seasoned politician, eventually serving as Senate Majority Leader before joining Hoover's ticket. Known for his political savvy and ability to build consensus, Curtis initially seemed like a strong addition to Hoover's campaign, helping to secure support from conservative factions and Midwestern voters. However, once in office, the partnership between Hoover and Curtis proved uneasy. Curtis's influence was minimal, and Hoover, a technocratic and often aloof figure, rarely sought his input. The two men had little personal rapport, and Curtis spent much of his tenure sidelined from decision-making, especially as the Great Depression worsened. As public discontent grew, Curtis was seen as emblematic of an old-guard Republican establishment increasingly out of touch with the suffering population. Despite his groundbreaking status and deep experience in the Senate, Curtis's time as vice president was marked by political frustration and public indifference. After the crushing defeat of the Hoover-Curtis ticket in 1932, Curtis faded quickly from national prominence. Yet his legacy as a trailblazer, bridging Native American and mainstream political life, remains significant. In many ways, Curtis's vice presidency was a missed opportunity, his talents underutilized at a moment when bold leadership was desperately needed, and his groundbreaking background too often overlooked in the political turmoil of the Great Depression.
John Nance Garner, who served as vice president under Franklin D. Roosevelt from 1933 to 1941, was once one of the most powerful and experienced politicians in Washington. A Texan with a long tenure in the House of Representatives, including a term as Speaker, Garner brought legislative clout and deep knowledge of Congress to Roosevelt's ticket during the depths of the Great Depression. Early in their partnership, Garner played a key role in pushing New Deal legislation through a sometimes skeptical Congress, leveraging his relationships and negotiating skills to help implement Roosevelt's sweeping agenda. However, the alliance between the two men began to fray as their visions for the country diverged. Garner, a fiscal conservative at heart, became increasingly uneasy with the growing scope of federal programs and Roosevelt's willingness to expand executive power. Their personal and political split widened dramatically during Roosevelt's controversial attempt to expand the Supreme Court in 1937, an effort Garner staunchly opposed. By Roosevelt's third term, the vice president had become an open critic, and the once close relationship turned into quiet hostility. Garner even challenged Roosevelt for the Democratic nomination in 1940, though his campaign quickly fizzled. Famously, he once described the vice presidency as not worth a bucket of warm spit, a quote that has haunted the office ever since. While his influence waned in later years, Garner was a pivotal force during the earliest and most critical moments of Roosevelt's presidency. His evolution from loyal lieutenant to disillusioned rival highlighted the growing ideological divide within the Democratic Party and underscored the vice presidency's limited power when the president chooses not to share it.
Henry A. Wallace, vice president under Franklin D. Roosevelt from 1941 to 1945, brought an unusual combination of intellectualism, idealism, and progressive zeal to the office. A former Secretary of Agriculture, Wallace was deeply committed to scientific innovation and social reform, and he believed that government had a moral obligation to serve the people.
His promotion to the vice presidency during Roosevelt's third term signaled a sharp turn leftward and was met with skepticism by many party insiders. Wallace was not a traditional politician. He was a thinker, a prolific writer, and someone who spoke openly about economic inequality, racial justice, and global cooperation at a time when such ideas were considered radical. He became an outspoken advocate for civil rights and internationalism, championing policies that many Democrats found too ambitious or naive. Although Roosevelt appreciated Wallace's intellect and loyalty, he kept him at a distance from key wartime decisions, and many in the Democratic Party grew wary of his unconventional views. By the 1944 election, conservative factions within the party had successfully lobbied Roosevelt to replace Wallace on the ticket with the more moderate and politically palatable Harry S. Truman. Wallace left the vice presidency but remained politically active, later running for president in 1948 on the Progressive Party ticket, a campaign that faltered under Cold War pressures and accusations of being too sympathetic to the Soviet Union. Wallace's tenure as vice president remains one of the most ideologically distinct in American history. He represented a vision of government centered on bold change and global peace, but his forward-thinking ideals ultimately clashed with the rising pragmatism and anti-communist sentiment of post-war America. Harry S. Truman entered the vice presidency in 1945 with modest expectations and limited influence, having replaced Henry Wallace as a compromise candidate acceptable to both progressive and conservative Democrats. A former senator from Missouri with a reputation for honesty and oversight, particularly through his work on the Truman Committee investigating wartime spending, he was respected but not widely known. His time as vice president was remarkably short, just 82 days. During that time, President Roosevelt kept Truman largely out of major wartime strategy discussions and didn't fully brief him on critical matters, including the existence of the atomic bomb. As a result, Truman's elevation to the presidency following Roosevelt's passing in April 1945 came as a shock not only to the American public, but to Truman himself. Thrust into the most powerful office in the world during the final months of World War II, Truman had to make immediate and world-altering decisions, including the use of nuclear weapons in Japan. His brief stint as vice president serves as a sobering reminder of how little the office can prepare someone for the sudden responsibility of the presidency. Yet Truman adapted quickly and decisively, steering the U.S. through the close of the war and into the complex early years of the Cold War. His vice presidency may have been short-lived, but it stands as one of the most consequential transitions in American history. The Truman story underscores the importance of selecting a vice president, not just for political balance, but for readiness, because in a single moment, the office can go from symbolic to central in shaping global events.
Alben W. Barkley served as vice president under Harry S. Truman from 1949 to 1953, bringing decades of congressional experience to a White House facing post-war transitions in Cold War tensions. A skilled orator from Kentucky and former Senate Majority Leader, Barkley was seen as a steady hand and party loyalist, a reliable bridge between Truman and a Congress often hesitant to support his fair deal policies. Barkley's charm and warmth stood in contrast to Truman's more plain-spoken demeanor, and their personal rapport helped solidify the administration's public image as down-to-earth and principled. Barkley embraced his vice presidential duties with enthusiasm, frequently representing the administration in public speeches, foreign visits, and legislative negotiations. He was notably more involved than many of his predecessors, helping lay groundwork for the modern vice presidency as an active partner rather than a ceremonial figurehead. Despite his popularity, Barkley's age became a sticking point by 1952, when he hoped to seek the Democratic nomination for president. At 74, party leaders believed he was too old, and his candidacy failed to gain momentum. Still, Barkley left office respected and admired across party lines. He remained politically active until his passing in 1956, famously collapsing while delivering a speech, ending his life doing what he loved most.
Barkley's time as vice president helped reframe the role as one of outreach, influence, and visible support for the president's agenda. While not a transformative figure, his legacy lies in proving how the office could be dignified, useful, and respected without demanding the spotlight.
Richard Nixon's tenure as vice president from 1953 to 1961 under Dwight D. Eisenhower redefined the role, transforming it from ceremonial figurehead to political heavyweight. At just 39 when he took office, Nixon brought energy, ambition, and a fierce anti-communist stance to a post often considered a political backwater. He became the administration's most visible representative abroad, traveling to dozens of countries and famously engaging in the kitchen debate with Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, an impromptu exchange that showcased Cold War tensions through consumer goods and ideology. Domestically, Nixon presided over the Senate and served as Eisenhower's attack dog, often delivering partisan speeches the president himself preferred to avoid. Despite his rising profile, Nixon's relationship with Eisenhower was complicated. The president kept him at arm's length on many major decisions, especially after Nixon was sidelined during Eisenhower's health scares. Questions about whether Nixon was ready to assume the presidency in an emergency became a recurring theme, particularly after a controversial televised fun speech in 1952, later known as the Checker speech, where he defended himself emotionally before a national audience. Yet Nixon endured and gained significant public sympathy, helping to solidify the power of television in political life. His 8 years as vice president were the longest of the 20th century up to that point, and laid the foundation for his own presidential bids. Nixon's time in office helped modernize the vice presidency, proving it could serve as a launching pad for greater ambitions. He left the role as one of the most prominent and polarizing political figures of his era, a reputation that would follow him all the way to the presidency and beyond.
Lyndon B. Johnson became vice president in 1961 under John F. Kennedy, bringing with him a towering presence in Washington as the former Senate Majority Leader. Known for his mastery of legislative maneuvering and the infamous Johnson treatment, his persuasive, sometimes intimidating style, he had been one of the most powerful men in Congress. Yet the transition to vice president proved more frustrating than empowering. Kennedy, surrounded by younger advisors from Harvard and eager to project a modern image, kept Johnson largely on the sidelines. Excluded from key decisions in foreign policy discussions, Johnson found himself reduced to ceremonial roles, cutting ribbons and attending funerals, far from the center of the action where he had once thrived. Despite this, he remained fiercely loyal, and his deep ties in Congress remained valuable to the administration when pushing through key legislation. Everything changed on November 22, 1963. Following the tragic assassination of President Kennedy, Johnson was sworn in aboard Air Force One, immediately assuming the presidency during one of the most traumatic moments in American history. His experience and political acumen allowed him to take charge swiftly, stabilizing the nation and continuing Kennedy's vision with landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act and the Great Society programs. Johnson's vice presidency is often remembered less for what he did in the role and more for how swiftly and effectively he stepped into leadership when the country needed it most. His story is a stark example of how a sidelined vice president can become a defining figure in American history almost overnight.
Hubert Humphrey served as vice president under Lyndon B. Johnson from 1965 to 1969, during one of the most turbulent periods in American political history. A longtime senator from Minnesota, Humphrey was known for his optimism, eloquence, and unwavering commitment to civil rights. His selection as Johnson's running mate was meant to balance the ticket ideologically and energize the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. Initially, Humphrey embraced the vice presidency with energy and enthusiasm, supporting Johnson's ambitious domestic agenda, including the war on poverty and Medicare. However, the escalation of the Vietnam War soon cast a long shadow over his role. Humphrey became increasingly constrained, publicly supporting a war he had private reservations about. Johnson demanded loyalty, and Humphrey, eager to maintain his influence, complied.
alienating many anti-war Democrats and activists who had once admired him. His position became politically toxic as protests mounted and the party splintered. When Humphrey ran for president in 1968, he struggled to define his candidacy apart from Johnson's unpopular war policy. Despite a late surge, he narrowly lost to Richard Nixon. Humphrey's time as vice president reflects the painful balancing act of serving a powerful president while holding personal convictions that may not align. His legacy is bittersweet, a passionate advocate for social justice trapped in the machinery of war politics. Yet, he remained a respected figure, later returning to the Senate and continuing to champion progressive causes. Humphrey's vice presidency is remembered as a cautionary tale about political loyalty, timing, and the limits of influence from the second highest office in the land.
Spiro Agnew's time as vice president under Richard Nixon from 1969 to 1973 was one of the most dramatic and controversial in U.S. history. A relatively obscure governor of Maryland before joining the national ticket, Agnew was initially chosen for his perceived moderation and appeal to suburban voters. However, once in office, he quickly became the administration's most aggressive voice against critics of the Vietnam War, civil unrest, and what he labeled the liberal elite. Agnew's speeches, often written by Nixon's aides, were fiery and combative, earning him both devoted fans and fierce detractors. Phrases like nattering nabobs of negativism became part of the political lexicon, and Agnew's confrontational style made him a cultural lightning rod during an already polarized era. While Nixon remained behind the scenes, Agnew served as the administration's public bulldog, attacking the media, student protesters, and the anti-war movement with unrelenting energy. Despite his growing popularity with conservative voters, Agnew's political career came to a sudden and dramatic halt in 1973 when he was investigated for corruption stemming from his time as Baltimore County Executive and Governor of Maryland. The charges involved bribery and tax evasion, accusations he initially denied before ultimately resigning the vice presidency in exchange for avoiding jail time. His resignation, just months before the Watergate scandal would consume Nixon's presidency, marked the first time a sitting vice president had left office under criminal investigation. Spiro Agnew's legacy remains one of the most notorious in vice presidential history, a cautionary tale of how political theatrics and personal misconduct can bring even the most powerful careers to a stunning end.
Gerald R. Ford became vice president in 1973 under the most unusual of circumstances, stepping into the role after Spiro Agnew's sudden resignation. At the time, Ford was the House Minority Leader, a Republican from Michigan known for his decency, loyalty, and steady temperament. Though not considered a major national figure, his reputation for honesty made him a safe and stabilizing choice during a moment of crisis. Ford was the first person appointed vice president under the 25th Amendment, setting a precedent in constitutional succession. Despite having spent decades in Congress, Ford had a little time to acclimate to his new role. Within months, the Watergate scandal accelerated, and in August 1974, Richard Nixon resigned the presidency. Ford was sworn in as the 38th president, making him the only person in U.S. history to serve as both vice president and president without being elected to either office. His vice presidency, though brief, was critical. It positioned him to lead the country during one of its most profound crises of confidence. As president, he immediately sought to heal the nation, famously declaring, "Our long national nightmare is over." However, his controversial decision to grant Nixon a full pardon caused a major backlash and may have contributed to his eventual electoral defeat in 1976. Still, Ford's legacy as vice president is often viewed positively. He embodied a return to calm and credibility at a time when American politics was shaken by scandal. His rise from the quiet chambers of Congress to the White House remains one of the most remarkable transitions in modern U.S. political history. Nelson Rockefeller served as vice president under Gerald Ford from 1974 to 1977, during a rare period of unelected leadership at the highest levels of U.S. government. A wealthy heir to the Rockefeller fortune and a four-term governor of New York, he brought to the vice presidency a long record of public service, ambitious reform, and controversial decisions.
Though he had previously sought the presidency multiple times, Rockefeller was often seen as too liberal for the Republican base. Still, his extensive experience in both domestic and foreign affairs made him a compelling choice for Ford, who was newly elevated to the presidency and eager to project competence. Unlike many modern vice presidents, Rockefeller was not shy about asserting his views. He clashed with conservatives in the administration, especially Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, over issues like social spending and government reform. His outspoken nature and independent streak made him a political liability in Ford's eyes as the 1976 election approached. Though Rockefeller had expected to play an influential role, Ford eventually sidelined him and chose not to include him on the ticket when he ran for a full term. Despite this disappointment, Rockefeller's time as vice president helped reshape expectations for the office. He was deeply involved in policy discussions, took on special assignments, and worked on domestic initiatives, even while lacking a strong base of political support in the White House. His tenure ended quietly, but his vice presidency reflected a shift toward a more active and substantive role, paving the way for future VPs to play larger parts in governance, even if they were sometimes controversial figures themselves.
Walter Mondale, who served as vice president under Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981, redefined the office into the modern role we recognize today. Before Mondale, vice presidents were often marginalized, ceremonial figures with limited access to the president. But Mondale changed that by becoming the first VP to establish a permanent office in the West Wing, with regular access to Carter's inner circle and a key seat at the table during policy discussions. A former senator from Minnesota with a reputation for pragmatism and liberal values, Mondale was well liked in Washington for his intellect and integrity. His background made him an ideal complement to Carter, a Washington outsider who needed someone with experience navigating the Capitol's complex political machinery. Mondale took on significant responsibilities, advising on foreign policy, civil rights, and budget matters. He also played a behind-the-scenes role during crises like the energy shortage and the Iran hostage situation. Though the Carter administration faced major challenges, including inflation and strained international relationships, Mondale's effectiveness as a working partner helped keep the executive branch functioning cohesively. His loyalty and quiet influence set a new precedent for what the vice presidency could be. After leaving office, Mondale remained a respected public figure and later became the Democratic nominee for president in 1984. Though he lost in a landslide to Ronald Reagan. Nevertheless, Mondale's transformation of the vice presidency left a lasting impact. His model of active engagement and policy involvement became the blueprint for future VPs, turning the role from symbolic standby into an essential part of the American executive team.
George H.W. Bush served as vice president under Ronald Reagan from 1981 to 1989, bringing a wealth of diplomatic, military, and political experience to the role. A former congressman, UN ambassador, envoy to China, and CIA director, Bush was one of the most qualified individuals ever to become vice president. His calm demeanor and loyalty to Reagan helped balance the administration's often hardline rhetoric with measured pragmatism. Despite once referring to Reagan's economic policies as voodoo economics during the 1980 Republican primaries, Bush proved a devoted second-in-command, rarely disagreeing with the president publicly and instead serving as a reliable surrogate on the world stage. He traveled extensively, meeting with foreign leaders and representing U.S. interests abroad, while also leading a task force on deregulation and anti-drug efforts at home. One of the defining moments of his vice presidency came during the Iran-Contra scandal, where he remained largely untouched, though his closeness to Reagan prompted scrutiny. Bush's tenure reflected a disciplined and respectful approach to the role, avoiding controversy and reinforcing the growing trend of vice presidents acting as trusted advisors rather than mere backups. His familiarity with both domestic and international affairs allowed him to function as a steady hand in times of tension.
In 1988, Bush successfully ran for president, becoming the first sitting vice president since Martin Van Buren to be elected to the presidency outright. His time as vice president showcased the value of experience, discretion, and diplomatic skill in the office, solidifying its evolution into a serious position of influence within the executive branch.
Dan Quayle served as vice president under George H.W. Bush from 1989 to 1993, and his time in office is often remembered more for controversy and public perception than for behind-the-scenes influence. A senator from Indiana with a strong conservative background, Quayle was chosen to help shore up support among younger voters and the Republican base. However, his relatively limited experience and youthful appearance led many to question whether he was truly ready for the presidency if needed. Throughout his vice presidency, Quayle faced a barrage of media scrutiny and became a frequent target of late-night comedy, especially after a televised moment where he incorrectly corrected a schoolchild's spelling of potato to potato-y. That single incident, while minor, seemed to crystallize broader doubts about his intellect and qualifications in the public's mind. Despite the ridicule, Quayle did take on real responsibilities. He led the Council on Competitiveness, which sought to reduce regulatory burdens on businesses, and he played a visible role in articulating the administration's values, especially on family and cultural issues. He was an outspoken critic of what he saw as declining moral standards, famously criticizing the television character Murphy Brown for being a single mother, a speech that sparked a national debate about family values and media influence. While Quayle remained a loyal and dependable member of the administration, he never quite escaped the shadow of public skepticism. His time as vice president underscores how media image can shape and sometimes distort a politician's legacy, regardless of the real substance behind the scenes.
Al Gore served as vice president under Bill Clinton from 1993 to 2001, forming one of the most active and influential vice presidential partnerships in American history. A former senator from Tennessee and the son of a prominent politician, Gore brought deep knowledge of government, science, and defense policy to the ticket. Unlike some of his predecessors, Gore wasn't content to sit on the sidelines. He was Clinton's close advisor, often described as a co-pilot in the administration. His main policy focus was technology, environmental protection, and government reform. He was a major proponent of the Reinventing Government initiative, aimed at streamlining federal agencies and improving efficiency. Gore also pushed for greater investment in the emerging internet infrastructure, helping to pave the way for the digital revolution. Though critics mocked his phrasing when he said he took the initiative in creating the internet, the truth is he played a key role in championing its development through public funding and legislation. On the world stage, Gore was a steady hand, meeting with foreign leaders and helping shape diplomatic strategies. His deep environmental commitment earned him praise from activists, but also criticism from industries wary of regulation. Though Gore was often perceived as overly serious or robotic compared to Clinton's charisma, he was widely respected for his intellect and discipline. His time as vice president culminated in a razor-close run for the presidency in 2000, which he lost to George W. Bush after a highly controversial Supreme Court decision. Despite that loss, Gore's legacy as vice president remains strong, defined by innovation, policy expertise, and a new vision of environmental leadership in American politics.
Dick Cheney served as vice president under George W. Bush from 2001 to 2009 and quickly became one of the most powerful and controversial figures to ever hold the office. Unlike previous vice presidents who operated quietly in the background, Cheney was a central player in nearly every major decision during the Bush administration, especially in the aftermath of the September 11th attacks. A former White House Chief of Staff, Secretary of Defense, and Congressman, Cheney brought decades of experience to the role and used it to exert unparalleled influence on matters of national security, defense, and foreign policy. He was a leading voice behind the invasion of Iraq in 2003, making the case for weapons of mass destruction that were never found.
Cheney's advocacy for expanded executive power and surveillance in the name of national security redefined the balance of power within the federal government and raised alarms among civil liberties advocates. Behind the scenes, he cultivated relationships across the intelligence community and steered the administration's response to terrorism with a firm hand. While his approach earned praise from supporters who saw him as a steady wartime leader, critics viewed him as a shadow president, pulling strings beyond what the public realized. His low public profile only added to the mystique and suspicion. Unlike most vice presidents, Cheney rarely attended ceremonial events or sought the spotlight. Instead, he focused on wielding influence where it mattered most. His legacy remains sharply debated. Some view him as a necessary realist in a dangerous world, and others as a symbol of overreach. But few dispute that his vice presidency marked a turning point, transforming the role into one of strategic dominance within the executive branch.
Joe Biden served as vice president under Barack Obama from 2009 to 2017, bringing decades of political experience and a distinctly human touch to the administration. A longtime senator from Delaware, Biden was chosen in part to balance Obama's relative youth and outsider status with Washington know-how. He had deep roots in foreign policy, chairing the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he became one of the most influential vice presidents in history, not by dominating the scene, but by offering trusted counsel and navigating tricky political landscapes with pragmatism. Biden's role was marked by quiet but consistent involvement in legislative negotiations, particularly during the 2009 financial crisis and the passage of the Affordable Care Act. He was often the one who went to Capitol Hill to hammer out compromises, relying on relationships he had built over decades. But he also had a personal warmth that contrasted with the often cool demeanor of the administration, becoming known for his empathy and unfiltered, sometimes folksy remarks. Internationally, Obama often leaned on Biden for diplomatic assignments in unstable or sensitive regions, including Ukraine and Iraq, trusting his ability to speak directly with foreign leaders. Perhaps most memorably, his presence added emotional resonance to moments of national significance, comforting grieving families or advocating for cancer research after the loss of his son. Biden's bond with Obama became a defining feature of their tenure, symbolizing loyalty, trust, and mutual respect. When he left office in 2017, Biden was more than just a vice president. He was a familiar and deeply human face of the administration. That image would later serve as a foundation for his own successful bid for the presidency.
Mike Pence served as vice president under Donald Trump from 2017 to 2021, a period marked by intense political polarization and unpredictable shifts in leadership style. A former congressman and governor of Indiana, Pence was initially chosen to balance the ticket with his calm demeanor, evangelical Christian background, and traditional conservative values. Throughout his vice presidency, he cultivated a low-profile, disciplined image, positioning himself as a loyal and steady second-in-command amid the chaos and controversy that often surrounded the Trump White House. He led the administration's COVID-19 task force, becoming a visible face of the federal response to the pandemic, though his messaging often reflected the delicate balance of aligning with public health officials while also supporting the president's more aggressive reopening rhetoric. Pence also played a key role in advancing the administration's agenda in Congress, especially on tax reform and judicial appointments. Behind the scenes, he frequently met with Republican lawmakers and conservative groups, reassuring them of the administration's commitment to core party goals. However, his defining moment came at the end of his term, during the January 6th Capitol attack. As president of the Senate, it fell to Pence to certify the results of the 2020 presidential election, a ceremonial duty that became a flashpoint after Trump urged him to overturn the outcome. Pence refused, citing the Constitution, which led to a sharp public break with Trump and placed him at the center of one of the most dramatic political crises in modern U.S. history. Though his style was subdued, Pence's time as vice president was anything but uneventful, placing him at the heart of historic debates about democracy, loyalty, and constitutional responsibility.
Kamala Harris became Vice President of the United States in 2021, making history on multiple fronts. As the first woman,
the first African American and the first person of South Asian descent to hold the office, her election marked a significant cultural and political milestone in American history. A former prosecutor, California Attorney General, and U.S. Senator, Harris brought a sharp legal mind and dynamic political presence to the Biden administration. Her vice presidency began during a moment of deep national division, a global pandemic, and a struggling economy, placing immediate weight on her role. Early on, she was tasked with high-stakes responsibilities, such as addressing the causes of migration from Central America and promoting vaccination efforts nationwide. Harris also served as the administration's voice on issues of equity and justice, championing voting rights and civil liberties in the political landscape increasingly shaped by partisan battles. While her portfolio was ambitious, it also exposed her to criticism from both sides, supporters eager for quicker results, and opponents targeting her for ideological or cultural reasons. Public perception of her tenure has fluctuated, reflecting the complexities of navigating a groundbreaking position in an era of intense scrutiny. Yet, her presence in the White House is often seen as a symbolic leap forward for a country long defined by traditional political leadership. Harris has emphasized coalition building, outreach to underrepresented communities, and firm support of the administration's legislative goals. As the first vice president to break so many barriers at once, she carries not only the responsibilities of governance, but also the weight of representation. Her impact will ultimately be measured not just by policy, but by how she reshaped public expectations of who can lead at the highest levels.